In our last video, we discussed the Age of Terra, followed closely by the Dark Age of Technology, the age in which humanity made a massive explosion across the galaxy. And we concluded by talking about the rising Age of Strife, or as it is known, Old Night. And today we're going to focus on Old Night, the era in which the Emperor rises to the fore of humanity in the Unification Wars that are fought across Terra's surface. So let's dive in, as this is going to be a pretty dense subject. The Unification Wars are a pretty broad subject, but on top of that, they're a very old one. So there are going to be a lot of things that we discuss that have been retconned from some of the new Horus Heresy novels, because a lot of this information comes from old Forge World Horus Heresy books that came out in the mid to late 90s. So a lot of this information is very dated, and it is getting reworked more and more and more. And I'll be totally honest with you guys, this video might be completely obsolete in 4 or 5 months as we wrap up the Horus Heresy series. But let's dive in and let's see what we have to go through. Before we get rolling on Old Night, I want to backtrack a bit to the end of the Dark Age of Technology. The Cybernetic Revolt was a massive turning point in human society. The Iron Men were the strongest tool that humanity had ever built. Second to the Eldar, humanity had established a far-spanning federation of both aliens and humans. And what kept those aliens in check was the fear of the Iron Men. Iron Men ruled every facet of life, from military to even hospitals, freeing humanity to kind of pursue things like, I don't know, crocheting and making a bigger, longer, and stronger selfie sticks. So when humanity won the Cybernetic Revolt, it opened the door to the aliens looking to rise against the humans. Without the Iron Men, the humans tried to fall back on their alien allies to help them learn just simply basic procedures once more, which you can imagine did not go too well with the previously subjugated alien populace. So wars broke out across the galaxy, with races such as the Orcs looking to take advantage of the vastly weakened human race. In addition to the alien incursions, we also know of the rampant rise of demons across the cosmos as the birth of Slaanesh with the fall of the Eldar was imminent. The Psykers, appearing on every world, were willing gates for demons to pour through, devouring entire planets. Only the most xenophobic of populaces that killed Psykers immediately were spared. And then lastly, there were interspecies wars with humanity. With the rampant amount of gene manipulation that was pretty prevalent throughout the Dark Age, some portions of humanity had actually evolved from the parent race, becoming their own race altogether. And this growing separation as a result of the revolt turned to outright hostility, with entire systems completely nuking each other into oblivion, scouring verdant planets such as Baal Primus. For those of you that have read The Devastation of Baal, Gabriel Seth talks about the obvious scarring on the planet that is still there 12,000 years after the fact. The long ago war is what he remarks it as, saying that none of the current Imperial arsenal has the ability to leave a lasting nuclear presence like this, millennia after the fact. Statements like that really kind of they really get me excited, just to imagine the sheer technological might of the time is awesome. And I love how it's so enigmatic and it's so hidden. It's not so like, oh, well, here's the big diatribe of the times of the Dark Age of Technology, and here's the extensive written detail. But I like that it's almost hearsay, that it's written in the same kind of manner that George R.R. Martin does for Game of Thrones. When you read a lot of Game of Thrones books, the history is not laid out before you saying, here's what happened, so on and so forth. It's always like hearsay, and it's always these stories that are told secondhand, like, oh, did you hear what happened at the Trident? Oh, Rhaegar Targaryen really died at the Trident. Oh, well, here's how this progresses through all these books. And that's what I really like about the Dark Age of Technology, is that it is such a fragmented portion of the history of the Warhammer world, and even the information we know about it is told in little scant messages here and there between all these different books and all these different things. It makes it a little bit more enriching. But either way, in the span of a millennia or two, all the unity that was gained with the Age of Technology was lost, and the final death bell and the beginning of the Age of Strife was the beginning of the birth of Slaanesh. In M25, Terra was cut off from the rest of humanity, as was the majority of every system, each one racked with their own breed of the chaotic miasmas that were the warp storms overtaking the galaxy. This was Slaanesh's consolation prize to the Milky Way. Thanks, Eldar, for all the murder orgies. Here's a bunch of cosmic anomalies. And arguably, though, this is what might have been what preserved the human race. Cut off from each other, they were also isolated from the rampaging aliens looking to pick apart the weakened empire. bringing everything back to the homeworld. The Sol system goes through a tumultuous time, the planets largely cut off from one another and vying for control of the system as it bounces between Mars and Earth, the power that is. Now, Terra goes through a pretty radical change. Gone are the pillars of civilization. By M28, the planet is divided into giant swaths of land, each controlled by their own warlord of their respective techno-barbarian clans. The Emperor doesn't shove off his smoking jacket and come to save the day immediately. What unfolds is a long period of barbaric feudalism that pervades each society with their varying levels of technological aptitude, some devolving all the way back to tribal occult zealots worshipping the ruinous powers. And all of what made humanity a force to be reckoned with has been swept away, namely, of course, the STC. The standard template construct system ceases to exist as a complete system or a repository of all the technological and scientific innovations of man. Fragments and kind of shattered copies exist out in the cosmos, but we'll get into that more as we discuss the Mechanicus in the next stage. And this is actually the birth of the Mechanicus as we know it. After suffering through an exhaustive war against psychic mutants on Mars that destroyed the planet's terraforming, turning it into a red wasteland once more, the Mechanicus rose to power. Devoted to protecting and even worshipping the technological advancements of the previous era, they fine-tuned the available technology that they had access to. The result was the beginning of the Legio Titanicus, and as we know it now, vast, bipedal engines of war, much different than the ones from the Dark Age that required a symbiotic connection with the machine spirits within. The ones from the Dark Age of technology, for the most part, were autonomous. They were basically large Iron Men, is the best way to describe it. But Mars was able to calculate the ebb and flows of the warp storm surrounding it, allowing them to attempt colonization missions during the ebb portions of their neighboring storms. And with some missions getting lost in the warp, others were able to establish what we know as forge worlds on distant planets, working autonomously from Mars to further search for technology. And these forge worlds were the closest things humanity had to its former pioneering heydays. Moving back to Terra, the geography of the time is not completely unfamiliar to ours, but tectonic plate shifts, wars, the oceans boiling away resulting in land where there was once sea due to nuclear holocaust, and tampering with the planet has made for an Earth that is, again, recognizable, but still not the one we know today. The planet was completely scoured from biological and thermonuclear warfare. Earth resembled a Mad Max movie at this point. And divided into massive greater and lesser empires, techno-barbarian warlords ruled each of their respective territories with the iron fist of totalitarianism. By M28, or I guess the later M28, the entire planet had devolved into constant warfare. Now, there are a lot of maps that are fan-made to try and represent this as best as possible, as there's absolutely no canonical display of what M28 Earth looked like. I'm going to show you guys screenshots from the Hearts of Iron 4 mod, Unification Wars. These will show each empire's locations relative to where they would reside on our Earth. I mean, the mod doesn't skew things to the way the actual quote-unquote lore has them. Keep in mind, we won't be talking about each and every one of these locations, just the major players. Then I'll show you a put-together map of everything as it is in the Warhammer world, and how a lot of the minor nations you see are actually rolled up into the grander nations, like the Empire of Yuan is actually consumed by the Empire of Ursh, and you'll see that as you look at these pictures. You're going to say, why isn't he talking about that? That's a large piece of land. I feel like it's important, but this is just me kind of prefacing that. Before getting into each empire and really the marrow of what is called the Unification Wars, we have to talk about a little-known figure in Warhammer lore. I don't think anyone's ever heard of him. The Emperor of Mankind. Now, if you're new to the lore of Warhammer 40,000, he might be a rather enigmatic figure, right? Especially if you haven't read any of the Horus Heresy series. But long, long ago, ancient human shamans who had what we now call psyker abilities discovered that when they died, their souls were getting devoured in the warp, ending their cycle of rebirth that they were used to. The shamans gathered together to sacrifice themselves in one grand ritual, combining their souls in the warp and being reborn as the Emperor of Mankind. and he has thus stayed in the background of history, emerging every so often as a pivotal character to shape and guide the world to new heights. This is supposed to have happened around, I've heard something as 8000 BC was as early as it happened, or I've heard things that it's in between the Stone and the Bronze Age. So there are a lot of conflicting reports as to when that this all happened. But throughout the Age of Strife, the Emperor worked on a number of projects before coming to the fore, namely the Primarch Project, producing 20 individuals that borrowed from his own genetic material to make the generals and leaders of his vast legions that would retake the stars. Remember how we talked about the Gellerfields protecting more than just ships? Well, as we read through the Horus Heresy novels, we find out that there was a Gellerfield protecting the Primarchs, and the destruction of that Gellerfield allowed the ruinous powers to send the Primarchs to the many corners of the galaxy. I don't want to spoil for you how that all goes down, but that's a good paraphrasing of it without doing that. But during this time, the Emperor also created his coveted guardians, the Legionis Custodes, the Emperor's personal bodyguard that predate even the Primarchs, constructed using the Dark Age of Technology's advanced, technology. Perhaps even before the fall of that era, each one of them is handcrafted by the Emperor to be the penultimate warrior, second only to the Primarchs and the Emperor himself, and they acted as not simply military tools, but also gifted scholars and advisors to the Emperor. And next we have the Thunder Warrior Project, genetically enhanced soldiers that were engineered to be ferocious and deadly, stronger combatants than the soon-to-be created Legionis Astartes, but also engineered to live short lives. These would serve as the kind of the backbone of the Emperor's unifying force in the war to come. And really, the funny thing here is, we talk about the Emperor, Primarchs, Space Marines, and Thunder Warriors. And Custodians. The Custodians and the Space Marines, the Thunder Warriors kind of sit in between them as far as the power scale goes. It was interesting to see that the Emperor had actually created something that was stronger than the Space Marines. But again, lastly, the Legionis Astartes, our beloved Space Marines, are smaller in stature and a degree less deadly than their Thunder Warrior predecessors, but they fight tactically, using better strategies, cohesion, and with a stronger sense of brotherhood and honor. The Space Marines are slowly produced throughout the Age of Strife as the Emperor kind of ramps up his production of them, and each one embedded with a gene seed which houses the genetic material of their legion's Primarch. In late M28, kind of early M29, the Emperor rose to prominence, creating the budding Imperium of Man with his base in the Himalayas Mountains. Himalayas. I mean, if it's not obvious to you guys, this is the Himalayan mountains, if you couldn't tell. The Terawatt Clan was one of the first empires to fall in line with the Imperial compliance. They lent their vast technological advancements to the Emperor's arsenal, helping to create the kind of proto-power armor and weapons that are perfected now today. So we can now really get into some of the major empires of the Unification Wars and the actions across this era as a whole. So for the most part, what I'm about to talk about right now is not in any kind of chronological order. There is no chronological order for the most part of any of this happening. We just know that it happened at one point during this time of the Emperor's compliance, these things, and so on and so forth. And you'll see as we go through this. But the only thing that I know that as far as, or I guess the only thing that is chronological on this list is maybe the first two empires we're going to go through and then the very last one. Everything else after that has got the same nomenclature of like, this is one of the last empires to fall. It's like, well, there's 15 of them. How are they all one of the last if there's only like 20? So it's like, make up your damn mind. So just kind of take this with a grain of salt. As far as me telling you the order of this is not in any way any kind of narrative or chronological order. It's just simply the way I decided to do it. Since we loosely talked about it, our first empire is the Terawatt Clan, or the Urals, located in the Ural Mountains of Europa. Being one of the first clans to fall under Imperial compliance, they were entirely unscathed from the resulting Unification Wars. But their technology and pursuits meshed well with the Mechanicum to soon come. And it is largely believed that the Terawatt clan was actually kind of already allied with the Emperor, but made a public display of supplication to start the snowball of compliance. It's kind of figured that the Emperor used the Terawatt clan and a number of other clans as kind of like, not like a shadow empire, like he was like, oh, I'm gonna fucking subterfuge my way through this, but used their assets to kind of undergo the projects that he took part in. Another empire that quickly fell in line is the Achaemenid Empire of Southwest Asia in modern-day Iran and ancient Persia. Mainly consisting of wealthier tribes, they also dodged a lot of the terror of the Unification Wars by allying quickly with the nascent Imperium. The Achaemenid Empire became the main recruitment ground for the Thousand Sons Legion, with Ironman and his brother, Ormuzd, both being Terran-born Marines, but yet pivotal characters in the stories to come. Old Albia, on the other hand, is another important empire that was ruled over by a particularly powerful tyrant called the Unspeakable King. When the Emperor came a-knocking, the Albians, which is obviously located in the British Isles, did not want to kneel before the Emperor. Instead, they fought the Emperor using their armored Ironside soldiers and proto-dreadnoughts. Suffering immense casualties, they were able to fight back the horde of Thunder Warriors. The Emperor, impressed with this kind of overall resilience and this tenacity of the people of Albia, issued a ceasefire and came to a diplomatic solution. The Albian clan lords, they saw that the Emperor was different from the other tyrants of Earth. He saw them, or at least he met them, on common ground. He approached them unarmored and unarmed, without like a whole huge, armed cadre. He was very, very open about what he had planned to do. His promise of traversing the stars once more was very genuine. Accepting the Emperor's diplomacy, Albia became one of the most zealous supporters of the Unification Wars. In addition, Albia was the recruiting grounds of mainly the Death Guard, but also the Night Lords and Iron Hands legions as well. Another empire, Boeotia, located in Greece and ancient Byzantium, is an empire that actually held out for a considerable amount of time against full unification. Rather than relying on military might, they used clever diplomacy to kind of prevent them from losing power. And the emperor maintained that the Yselti, the ruling class of Boeotia, would integrate slowly with their dignity intact. He kind of said, okay, well, I understand what they're trying to do. We'll let this kind of take its course. But after 150 years, they still did not integrate, and was eventually brought into compliance by elements of the Imperial Army and the newly formed Thousand Sons Legion. The Technocratic Union of America is, again, a pretty obvious one, but it is comprised of the entirety of North America, with Great Alba, or the Dominion of Caldi, or Canada, if you want to think of it that way, as its vassal state. The majority of the empire was a radioactive wasteland, with large hive cities far spread out from one another. So, the entire plotline of Judge Dredd. But a high amount of artillery and armor saw them fighting wars with the Empire of Ursh and other far distant enemies. But unfortunately, they quickly fell to the combined might of the Imperium. Despite the fact that they kind of have this raucous rapport as having artillery and armor and getting these huge engagements, the kind of lore behind them in the Unification Wars is like, oh, yep, they got beaten. But aside from that, nothing else of real import. Moving south, we have the Canton of High Brazil. It was located in Sud America, or South America, in modern day, Brazil. High Brazil was one of the last empires to fall, but it was the largest and strongest canton in Sud America. They were allowed to keep a lot of their autonomy, including their armed forces, the Dracos, which eventually become the Imperial Guard detachment alongside the Word Bearers Legion. You get to see a lot of the origins of a lot of these old school Imperial Army detachments that are a big part of the Great Crusade, or you get to see where a lot of the recruiting grounds are from these legions. I think that's what makes the Unification Wars so cool, is as we get more and more into the Horus Heresy series, we find out more and more about these individual nations and how they contribute to the whole. In distant Antarctica was the fortified city-state of Auriok, a heavily fortified location deep within a hollowed-out mountain. And it was relatively unscathed by the entirety of Old Night, and remained as a really great example of the vast degeneration of the species. The people of Auriok had undergone very little genetic deviation from their techno-barbarian peers, and were widely similar to humans pre-Old Night. And that's something we haven't really touched on yet, but we'll get into more, but I promise that. The Emperor dispatched the Word Bearers to deal with the people of Auriok, who were not diplomatic in the slightest. The Word Bearers met the city with aerial bombardments from macro bombers, artillery shelling, and the relentless advance of Space Marine. The city was destroyed to a man as the Ashen Circle detonated the plasma reactors, filling the city with electrified magma. Magma. Moving back north on the other side of the world, Scandinavia housed the techno-barbarian state of Nordic, notably the Maulon Sen Confederacy. This was one of the very first states to fall to outright aggression. A Thunder Legion led by 30 custodians and the Emperor himself fought through a force that outnumbered them 7-1. In the end, the priest king of Malin Sen was executed by the emperor, and that is what is now known as the Battle of Red Frost. For those of you guys who have read or are now reading the Master of Mankind, you will see this entire engagement talked about from a lot of the custodians' perspectives. I'm not going to talk about more and ruin it, but you'll find that in that book if you're curious about it. A little further south, a little more east, is the Caucus or the Caucus Wastes, located in the Caucasus Peninsula. Was home to the kind of technological, advanced techno-barbarian empire led by the ethnarch of the Caucus Wastes. Now, ethnarchs are these sort of scientist nobility that specialize in gene manipulation and biotechnology. And because of their vast scientific ability and the fortifications of the Caucus Wastes being comprised of a vast shield network, millions of Imperial lives were lost storming the Wastes. I think at one point they said that 10,000 Thunder Warriors died in an assault on the Wastes. So again, very heavily fortified. And the first real mission by the Salamander's Legion was the assault on the Tempest galleries, in which the Salamanders underwent a multiple-day mission using these subterranean machines, to burrow under the hive cities of the Caucasus and destroying the power plant that supplied the shields. This inevitably led to a really nice party with some, little finger sandwiches as a means of welcoming the Emperor's armies. Okay, I lied. That was a shit joke, but the Caucasus fell under the Imperial rule, no less. I can't remember 100% which book that is in. I want to say it's Vulcan Lives, or might actually be in Master of Mankind again. But a lot of this has come up very recently in the Horus Heresy series. Now, one of the largest empires was the Pan-Pacific Empire. It extended from East Asia, Australia, and across the Pacific Islands. Remember, that's not all water. This has all been boiled away for the most part, and there's scant amounts of water, if not only lakes at that point. But it was a superpower during the Age of Strife, ruled over by Narthan Dune, the half-mad, half-genius despot. And they fell easy enough during the Unification Wars, but in the following 30th millennium, before the Great Crusade truly started, a small portion of the Empire revolted. Vorni was the last domain to fall into compliance of the Pan-Pacific Empire during the Unification Wars. And when they revolted, the Emperor simply said, "Send in the Eighth," meaning the Masters of Terror themselves, the Night Lord. And it was to be a display of absolute no-holds-barred ass-slapping. Let the other empires know what happens if you break the treaties made with the Emperor. Starting with an orbital bombardment, they shook Vorni to its core. They kicked up so much dust from the 6-hour bombardment that it created artificial night. Then, the Night Lords descended in midnight clad, using orbital drops to intensify the terror. The Night Lords were really only like 500 strong at this point, but it was more than enough. The Night Lords recorded the screams of pain and of terror that the people made as they were just being slaughtered, only to be amplified by their vox grills as they continued their terror campaign. Some people they let run from the city just so they could be hunted down for sport. Every rebel was dragged back to the center of the city, strung up, and left alive to witness their entire city's destruction. Millions died as the city plummeted into a giant chasm in the earth. It's a pretty intense display of the Night Lord's terror tactics, but it's a very evident one nonetheless. Now, the biggest techno-barbarian empire was the Empire of Ursh in Central Asia and Russia, ruled over by the tyrant Caligan. Ursh made war with almost every other barbarian state, completely destroying the Nord-Afric conclaves and stealing their technology. As the Emperor's armies reached Ursh, they realized that Ursh itself were using fell magic to combat the Imperium. Caligan had become corrupted by the ruinous powers, but they did not protect him against the might of the Emperor, and the mightiest empire fell before the blades of the Emperor. And finally, the last empire I want to talk about is the Kingdom of Urartu in Asia Minor. This is also consequently the last empire to fall under compliance, marking the end of the Unification Wars. A titanic last battle was fought at the Battle of Mount Ararat, where the last remaining Thunder Warriors were slain to a man, with the very last one, Eric Tyrannus, planting the Raptor Imperialis, the banner of lightning, before succumbing to his wounds. The truth, however, is far darker. The final act of the Unification Wars was known as the Culling. In this, the Emperor, his custodians, and namely the Dark Angel's Legion, completely destroyed the Thunder Warriors to a man, with some, noteworthy side lore bits existing of one that escaped to Mars, another to the distant portions of the planet, or one to Pluto, all sorts of little entries here and there, but for the most part, the era of the Thunder Warrior had come to an end. Now, the biggest credo that the Imperium operated under was the Imperial Truth. That is to say that religion was cast aside and all forms of theology were forcibly destroyed and removed. The Church of the Lightning Stone was destroyed in the final days of the Unification War, removing all religion from Terra. I believe the church was either a Christian or a Catholic church. But the Imperial Truth operated under the secular belief that all things could be explained by science, math, and reason. Faith and religion were false constructs used by uncivilized and ignorant man. This Imperial Truth would be the clarion call of the Great Crusade to come. In addition to the Imperial Truth, the Emperor wanted to restore humanity to its pre-Old Knight state, and he went about a rigorous gene manipulation process to essentially repair the virus-soaked, irradiated genes of the former techno-barbarian states, producing a humanity that was reminiscent of the Dark Age of technology. All these acts heralded the next big age to come, as the warp storms around Earth subsided with the final wild birth of Slaanesh. The Emperor was finally free to move about the Sol system. Conquering Luna, Venus, and other neighboring planets, he finally came to Mars. And upon making planetfall in his void ship, the Emperor used a grand amount of psychic ability to conjure up a magnificent display, resulting in the Mechanicus believing him to be the Omnissiah in which they worshipped. Remember, the Mechanicus had a pretty vast command of technology, and was actually in charge of a pretty fractured, if not expanding, galactic empire. So the Emperor played a pretty important card here. The Treaty of Mars, or Treaty of Olympus as it were, enabled the two bodies to come under the same banner, creating the true birth of the Imperium of Man. The treaty allowed for Mars to continue their worship of technology as they were. Seeing the Emperor as the Omnissiah actually kind of suited his interests anyway, right? In addition, Mars, as well as its Forge worlds, would remain relatively autonomous as long as they continued to produce ships, armaments, and technology for the Crusades to come. But that's it. That's the grand age of strife, the Unification Wars, and the fall of Old Knight to start the next big era, the Great Crusade. This, of course, is where the Emperor reaches far out into the galaxy to find his wayward sons, which we'll discuss in our next video. And that's really, it's kind of a weird, kind of hard stop point right there, because right after that is, oh, he's got the ability to now traverse outside of the Sol system, so he can go crazy, and that is the beginning of the Great Crusade. But there's an important image I want to discuss with the Emperor, though. We get this figure that is seemingly all-knowing, or at least possessed of so many millennia of knowledge that he's far and away more knowing than anything to have ever existed. In that, he has a very fine-tuned ideal of how humanity is going to be able to survive, and is willing to walk on its razor's edge. You definitely start to see the Emperor become more of the same tyrant that he was supplanting with the Unification Wars under the guise of vindication and the betterment of humanity. In the more recent findings of the Horus Heresy novels, the Emperor is absolutely not displayed as an altruistic or benevolent individual. Rather, he is someone, and this is a phrasing of his own words, who will do whatever it takes to get the job done. Or paraphrasing of his own words, sorry. He's the spitting image of the Machiavellian ends justifying the means. The Thunder Warriors are an excellent example of a tool that was used to create the unified Terra. And as you read through the opening books of the Horus Heresy, you see some of the Marines questioning what will happen after the Great Crusade, remarking how they're meant for war, not policing a compliant populace. A lot of them speak out against the end of the Crusade as a means in which they will all be destroyed. And I think the shocking kind of duality of that statement is that the Great Crusade can never really possibly end, which might even have been the Emperor's goal, war in perpetuity, with constantly expanding borders that ebb and flow. And that is based on the current Imperium, which is devoid of the Emperor's guiding light, but still, if the Great Crusade had ended peacefully, then I'm under no illusion here. The Space Marines would have been put down, save maybe one legion to act as a shock force to keep wayward planets in line. We'll discuss more of the Great Emperor of Man in either a future video on the subject or even his own video. I'm not really sure, I haven't decided. But as always, guys, thanks so much for watching today. Hopefully you got a better idea of what Old Knight really is and how important these Unification Wars really were. But have a good one, guys, and take care.